Hello everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name's Charles Godfrey. I'm the director and I have two very simple tasks here. The first is just to remind people that we have another lecture this week on Wednesday, which is our James Martin Memorial Lecture over in the Sheldonian, and that's going to be given by our relatively new Chancellor, William Hague, on environment, health, society and economics. The tickets are selling like hotcakes, so if you would like to come, then do sign up sooner rather than later. But it's my great pleasure to pass over to Louise Fawcett, Professor Louise Fawcett, who is Director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Changing Global Order, who's going to introduce today's speaker. Louise.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Charles, for the introductory words, and thank you to the Oxford Martin School for hosting our programme, Changing Global Order, over the last 3 years, and for hosting us today. It's great to see a room full of students and colleagues, and I'm glad the rain did not put you off.
We certainly got wet coming over, the speaker and myself, one of the speakers. As Charles mentioned, I'm Louise Fawcett. I'm a Professor of International Relations and one of the directors of the programme. There are 4 of us on the programme. Andy Hurrell, who you'll shortly be hearing from, plus our 2 eminent historians, Patricia Clavin and Andrew Thompson. As the name of our programme suggests, our task is to look at questions of global order and change from a historical and contemporary perspective, to see what we can learn from the past and how the lessons of the past might inform the present and the future. I don't think any of us could possibly have imagined how topical this issue would be today. Over the last few years, you could hardly pick up a paper or read a journal article which does not alternatively proclaim, lament, or rather less often celebrate the decline or the end of the old international order. And as Amitav says at the start of his book, the headlines have got louder and louder. But one wonders just how long that speculation and frenzy about old and new world orders will endure. Well, that's the subject of our roundtable today. But it also builds on previous events. Last year, we had another roundtable here on this theme, and one of the participants was John Eikenberry, who, as many of you will know, has been a long-standing advocate of the idea of a liberal international order, understood as a US rules-based system, providing the cement of the post-World War world. For him, the United States was the liberal Leviathan. Others on the panel were more sceptical, and this skepticism has only increased as the second Trump presidency, abandoning Biden's discourse, has further distanced itself from the remains of liberal internationalism and its institutional architecture. And this is where we pick up the conversation today, by looking now at the nature of post-Western order and whether or not it really was a good thing. Again, we imagine possible futures by looking back and by asking questions about the meaning and legacy of Western dominance. And we're absolutely delighted to have 3 speakers who are perfectly equipped to do this, who will each offer their distinctive take on the question. First, Amitav Acharya, UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance, and Distinguished Professor at the American University in Washington, D.C. Amitav's a previous visitor to Oxford Martin School, but today we take as his point of departure the new book, The Once and Future World Order, Why Civilization will Survive the Decline of the West. And in that book, he reprises a theme he talked about over a year ago in this room, in which he powerfully argued that world order is not, and never has been, the monopoly or property of any civilization or nation. Second, Professor Andrew Hurrell, Senior Research Fellow in International Relations, and until quite recently, our Montague Burton Professor of International Relations here in Oxford. Andy is the author of On Global Order, which is a magisterial and enduring account about power, values, and the changing constitution of international society. And third, Professor Faisal Devji, who is the recently appointed Professor of Global and Imperial History here in Oxford. And in his work, he has explored questions surrounding the emergence of Islam as a global historical actor. His latest book, published this year, is Waning Crescent, The Rise and Fall of Global Islam. So just a bit of housekeeping. We've got about 45 to 50 minutes for the speakers, and I've asked them to limit their comments to 15 minutes or 10 to 15 minutes. After that, the question and answer session, and then I'll invite you all to continue the conversation next door, where we have a reception. And can I now remind everybody that this talk is being live streamed and recorded as of now, and so please bear that in mind when you ask questions. So with great pleasure, I hand you over to Amitav. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, very much for bringing me back here again. You know, some of you may not know, the first time I visited Oxford was when Louise started her career as a tutor in Exeter College, and the very first conference I attended in Oxford was because of her, and then I got to know through her Andy Hurrell, and we have been academic colleagues as well as like-minded researchers ever since. Last time I was here, the book did not have a title, or it didn't have a cover, or it did, but I was not allowed to share it. The commercial publishers are a very different kind of people, and they have too many restrictions on when you can announce and what you can announce. But now we have a cover, and we actually have a theme, and some of you might have already read it. So I am one of the panelists, so I'm not a speaker, unlike the last time I was speaking in this room. But let me just give you some idea of what the book is about. I'm here mainly to sell my books. So I have a flyer that you can pick up, 25% discount, unless Brianny has put some outside, but I have here. I have an article, New York Times, on this book. One of the great things that happened when the book came out is the New York Times actually asked me to write an article on this book. They had read the manuscript, and they published it on the day the book was published. So that's never happens, apparently. So I have a copy of that. Since it's on a paywall, you can pick it up. But let me, by the way, you may be wondering about this. This is generated by AI, Gemini. So I asked Gemini, can you do a multiplex for me? And then I said, with the Once and Future World Order on the cover. And that's what came up. So I think it's quite meaningful. It talks about polarity, but it also talks about the whole world behind it, multiplexity, and combining multipolar distribution of power, but the overarching structure of multiplex, which is much more than power. It's also ideas, interactions, and connectivity. So anyway, without further ado, since this panel is about this particular one of the questions, I start by flagging this. This is a book, as you probably know, it's a 5,000 years of history. Okay, there are many, many things. The contemporary last 100 years take up less than 5% of the book. But wherever I go, they say, what's going to happen? And I give up. Because except in the very academic university student audience, they actually want to know about Sumerians and Egyptians and Persians and the like. But most of the time, they want to know, this book has become kind of a sign of a relatively optimistic take on world order. And when the New York Times published my article, they usually, some of you may know, that usually big papers have two titles, so two alternative titles. And within the first half an hour, they try both with a focus group. And the focus group, the original title that I had agreed with the editor was called Who is Afraid of the Post-American World? But the focus group chose the second title, which is that Reasons to be Optimistic about the post-American world. So I have a little paper with a cover story of both the covers in there. So it kind of has become kind of a symbol of optimism to an extent that I am actually not. I will explain to you how optimistic I am. I am generally, but not to the extent it has been identified as such. And sometimes I regret that I wrote that 9% or 10% of the book about the 21st century. This is the basic argument: creating world order, chaos versus order, which is a very Egyptian way, 3,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, 3,000 BC, of way of looking at the function of order. The function of the king was to dispel chaos and provide stability, and this has been reproduced throughout history by almost every civilization, including the United States today. So the main argument is that it's not the monopoly of any single civilization or nation or region, but a shared creation. Now, shared can sound very wishy-washy, right? Everything is shared. For me, it is actually fact. And how is the world order creation is shared? I think two ways that I deal with it in my book. One is through independent innovation. Not everything is diffusion, one learning from the other. That happens a lot, but there is a fetish about diffusion these days, which is good. But a lot of things are independently created, ideas and institutions, without necessarily connections. So like the innovations of the pre-Columbian Americas, with the Iroquois, the Inca, the Maya, the Aztec, which I deal with, or some parts of Africa that are not necessarily connected to other parts of the world, certainly the pre-Columbian Americas. They have very great deal of resonance and similarity in the way empires and independent state systems are organized in other parts of the world. So human beings create similar institutions or respond to similar problems in similar ways. There's nothing should be striking about it. So we make too much out of cultural diversity and difference. We should also acknowledge that there is an underlying similarity in human responses or the planetary responses to issues of chaos or disorder. But then diffusion is, of course, very important. So I will want to deal with both, but I don't want to make it diffusion everything and leave out the independent innovation. And I look at several ideas and institutions that I find have been replicated, reproduced, or diffused, not the same, but similar, and ideas and institutions of world order, independence of states, which is, you can call it sovereignty, but it's basically that states should be independent of each other, not be gobbled up by an empire. An empire is, of course, there, and diplomacy, peace treaties, economic interdependence, humanitarian values, racial and religious tolerance, and much more has come from multiple civilizations. Some have contributed more to a particular idea than others, but there's no single idea that I know of, big idea, that is exclusively of one civilization. I mean, there's some exceptions, but generally you find a lot of similarity. And that's probably the biggest claim of the book, might be the most controversial claim. The last part, decline of Western dominance, is not necessarily a bad thing, need not be a bad thing, is become very controversial, and I can talk about it, but I just want to highlight that I'm talking about the decline of Western dominance. Very clear, it's not the decline of the West, it's not the decline of Western civilization. That's not the point. The decline of Western dominance, especially the kind of dominance we have had from Europe and the United States for the last 300 years, maybe 500 years. And the outcome is not necessarily a peaceful world, necessarily. It could be, because you have more ideas and ways of maintaining peace than what we have since the Westphalian days, but more inclusive, which some people may not think as a good thing, but actually a lot of people think it is a good thing. Okay, so these are some of the case studies I look at in the book. By the way, the book is divided not into thematic areas, it's divided according to civilizational spaces. That was deliberate. I initially wanted to do it in terms of ideas and institutions, but again, consultation with my editor, publisher, we decided it will be easier for a broader audience to relate to. So if you say, independence of states, interdependence. Most people may not relate, but if you talk about China, India, Islam, they can relate to it. So a lot of this book has been rewritten over 2 years. It was written, it could have been published 2 years ago, but to make it more palatable to a much wider audience, I had to redesign the book. That's the same substance. So independent state system, great power cooperation, just war principles, right to property and life, a decentralized empire. And these are independent creations. Like they emerged in several places independently of each other. There's no evidence of diffusion. But there are also ideas and institutions that we have evidence of diffusion, like competitive public service exams from China to Europe and US. China's major contribution to world order is not gunpowder compass, it's actually this. And there was definitely a bureaucracy, a functioning patrimonial bureaucracies that not chosen by the emperor but selected through public competitive exams is a big foundation of modern world order. And actually the West owes a lot to China for that. And we have diffusion, paths of diffusion in the book very clearly, looking at original documents. Long distance trade and connectivity, not surprised, rational mode of thinking, especially from Islamic philosophy in the so-called Middle Ages and contributing to European Enlightenment. And there is diffusion. And then interstate confederation also is part of the same. There's a lot more reciprocity from Andean civilization, and I'm deliberately giving you a much broader set of examples, because what I don't want people to think is that thus the West is not, or Western contribution is overstated, doesn't mean the Chinese and Indian contribution should be also overstated. I think there are a lot of other civilizations that played a role, and in some ways in much more meaningful way. Okay, so not much time. This is one example, the Amarna Great Powers. Just to talk about one word, kept peace in the Middle East for 200 years. The European concert kept peace for 50 years. Okay, so this is one big claim of the book. Humanitarian values, compare the Geneva Conventions with the Code of Manu. Manu has been criticized in India for supporting caste. No civilization is pure virtuous. No set of ideas is purely noble. But this is a code that we call it Code of Manu, but this was actually in practice in India. Why? Not because Indians had peace genes, such Xi Jinping claims about China, but India was full of violence. But it was a practical way of managing, containing the effects of violence. So not harming civilians, not harming soldiers that have surrendered, who are wounded, who are sick, who are fleeing. The Geneva Conventions of 2001 or 2100 BC, it's basically probably 2,300 years old. Indian Ocean, talk about power, talk about norms, talk about interaction. The biggest place for open trade, I don't want to call free trade, open trade, where anybody can trade as long as you pay a duty, was the Indian Ocean. Before, it was the largest oceanic trading system in the world before the Atlantic and the Pacific opened up. And we give a lot of credit to Hugo Grotius, who was actually an employee of the Dutch East India Company. And his brother, his cousin rather, sank a Portuguese ship in 1603 off Singapore and looted and sold all the goods in Rotterdam and Amsterdam, because the Portuguese were harassing and not allowing the Dutch to trade in the Indies. They were there first. But the Dutch BOC, Dutch East India Company, hired Grotius, young lawyer, to write a legal brief. And that legal brief, the first chapter of that became Mare Liberum. Grotius argued that sea belongs to everybody, the Portuguese should not be monopolizing the sea. But there are two things here. He got the Indian Ocean was already a Mare Liberum. So the Dutch East India Company provided him with documents of what was happening in the Indian Ocean. So he didn't get the idea just from European jurists, or certainly not from the Byzantine Empire, as some has claimed, because in the Roman system, free trade meant you have to be a Roman citizen, a Roman subject to have absolute right of free trade. you had to be, that was underwritten by an empire. Now, in the Indian Ocean, there was no empire. And the trade, openness of trade, was managed by small little port city states, Malindi, Malacca, Mogadishu, Aden, Hormuz, and Calicut, going up to Malacca. So good reason to believe that you don't need a hegemon to have open trading systems. Okay, so, and also when the Dutch went to do a lot worse than what the Portuguese had done, it established a bigger monopoly than the Portuguese did, and harassed the local sultans, say, you trade with us rather than trade with each other. So Makassar cannot trade with Malacca unless you go through the Dutch. The Sultan of Makassar, Sultan of Goa in Makassar said, God made the land and the sea. The land he divided among men, and the sea he gave in common. It has never been heard that anyone should be forbidden to sell the sea. So this tradition was very much prevalent there. Okay, so 3 examples. There are many, 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 many. I will just come to the conclusion. This is important. Why am I doing this? I mean, what are these old things? Is it anachronistic to bring in those old examples and say they are contemporary? They have relevance to world order? What does the Manna system of great power concept have to do with the modern great power diplomacy here? Well, we have a real serious double standard here, epistemic double standard. When it comes to Greece and Rome, we think they're modern, they're relevant, they are our ancestors. When it comes to other civilizations, we don't. So you can call them anything, anarcho-historicism, anachronism, backward projection of modern ideas, but we do that all the time, and it's part of what is necessary. Yeah. So we give a lot of credit, or almost exclusive credit, to Athens as the founder of democracy. I have no problems with that. But Athenian democracy, as Robert Dahl said, the deny that Athens was a democracy would be rather like saying that what the Wright brothers invented was not an aeroplane, because of their early machines little resembled ours today. So look at the Wright Flyer and look at the Singapore Airlines, right? So, but Singapore Airlines should not say that we invented, or even the Boeing and Airbus should not say. The principle was already there in early foundational, imperfect maybe, forms. So we give Greeks and Romans for republicanism, democracy, and many, many ideas. We don't give credit to other civilizations for similarly foundational ideas, supposedly imperfect, but some of them are actually more perfect. I think the just war principles in ancient India were better than what we have today. Greece was actually, Athens was a democracy, but as a conditional democracy, a limited democracy. Franchise, I mean, adult franchise, the right to vote was limited, and also the liberty of the Greek city-states meant liberty of the polis, not liberty of the individual. If you individuals challenged the polis, or went against the faith or ideology like Socrates, they were either ostracized or asked to commit suicide. Okay, so that's it. I don't want to take any further point, but I want to leave you with one. I contrast myself with Kissinger's book because this has been the best-selling book, and I used to use it for my students. And look at the chapterization. First chapter Europe, second chapter Europe. Islam is a world in disorder, and China and India little sections, and then America, of course, acting for all mankind. And I didn't want my students to only learn that. I still use it as a text. So I wanted to create a book, write a book that actually puts the record straight and covers all civilizations. There is no mention of race, no mention of Africa, no mention of pre-Columbian Americas as originators or builders of world order in Kissinger's book. And I thought we would need something, an alternative narrative, alternative history. I think I should stop here, and we'll have more discussion. There's a lot more, by the way, and you can talk about this. Some of this, if you don't want to read the book, you can read the articles, New York Times, Ethics and International Affairs, Foreign Policy, another one coming in Foreign Policy in German. But I think that you got the idea, right? Okay.
Thanks, Sandy. Go ahead, yeah.
And here are all the flyers.
You can stay there now, the thing's off, or you can come back here. It's up to you. You can stay. Whichever you prefer.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and thank you very much, Louise, for organising, and Amitav for writing the book above all. and then for talking today. How should we think about a post-Western world? Perhaps more importantly, how should we find a global we that finds a way, or can find a way, to debate productively what that post-Western world might look like? A way of talking that goes beyond just back and forth critiquing different positions or juxtaposing one perspective against another. It seems to me, given the fragility of the shared languages that we try to manage the conflicts and polarization that we see, that question of what I've often called epistemic anarchy, lies behind so much of the conflict. And I think one of the really most important things that Amitav's previous work and that this book does is to really help us open up the basis for a more productive discussion about how we might tell some shared story of the past and some more shared story about what a post-Western world might look like. So I'm just going to say a few things, almost all in agreement, because I share so much of how Amitav sees the world, and then pick up sort of 2 points. The first is about, maybe it is about the 5%. It's about whether the changing nature of the modern global, particularly the systemic and structural character of the modern global, doesn't take us into a different place, that we have to think very hard about the differences from so many of the things that Amitav is describing in the past. And secondly, about the range of options on the table when we talk about order in a post-Western world. Are we in a post-Western world? Well, there's no great, enormous time to debate that. I'll simply say yes. At least we're heading very much in that line. Obviously, there's a huge debate, not least at the very particular moment we're experiencing, because there are many people who are claiming that just as we saw in the 1970s, when there was a lot of talk about the decline of Western dominance, we're seeing the reassertion of certainly United States, maybe Western power, making America great again. It seems to me that that actually is destined to fail, but that the death of what I've often called the hegemonic presumption is an immensely difficult and highly dangerous process. So not time to discuss, but it seems to me the long-run trend is against, what is in favor of what Hedley Bull 50 years ago talked about in terms of the revolt against Western dominance. We can debate sort of the length of that time. Amitav just mentioned 500 years. I think many people would actually date Western dominance as something much more short-lived. We've come out of the global liberal order, so-called. We've come out of American dominance in the post-Cold War world. We kind of think, well, that's just obviously how the world is. And yet I think there's a very strong case that Western dominance was actually much more short-lived than that. And even a historian like Chris Bailey actually says, well, even at the point when it looked so obvious that Western ideas and power and economic power was all dominant, it was, in his words, friable and very vulnerable, even at the beginning of the 20th century. So what I think Amitav does in the book is to build on all of those people who've been talking about the way in which the emergence, even of this so-called Western-dominated world, was not the product of the West taking these ideas and simply giving them to other people. So the move against the dominance of diffusionist ideas in favor of a view that stresses mutual constitution, that stresses autonomous origins, that stresses diversity in a much deeper sense. We can think of, what's this book really counterposed against? Amitav just mentioned Kissinger and the World Order book. And the World Order book is, although it's kind of late in Kissinger's kind of life, actually reflects very long-standing ideas. It's very noticeable that, with the exception of China, India has about 3 pages in the entire book. In 1969, the Chilean foreign minister came to Washington and talked to Kissinger. And Kissinger said to him, "You come here talking of the third world. The third world has no history. The arrow of history starts in London, goes to Berlin, goes to Moscow, goes to Beijing, goes to Tokyo, comes back to Moscow." I mean, this is an sentence that could have been said in 1850, but it perfectly characterizes that notion of the third world having no history. Or even to take a very different kind of figure, Eric Hobsbawm. The dynamic of the greater part of world history in the past 2 centuries were derivative and not original. It was the West that was the original core, and everything else was derivative against it. So what Amitav is doing is building on that, but taking us much further back. So we already have people describing that picture of the Indian Ocean in the 18th century and saying, look, this was a system, this was a set of orders about trade, about law, which was not centered around the West and Western ideas. Jason Sharman, Andrew Phillips' book, but going back particularly to a leading figure like Charles Alexandrovich, who talked about the law of the Indies in terms of a law that was open in civilizational terms. And then, of course, Amitav goes back much further, and I'll pick that up in a moment. So, the book is arguing against what Amitav calls the ignorance and arrogance of the West, the reminder not just that not everything started here and went there, but also of the injustices and instabilities that lie behind so many of the claims that the West was the source of order. Indeed, we actually constantly need to keep reminding ourselves that academic international relations debates about world order, the sort of stuff that everything in IR courses talks about, was a product of the colossal failures of Western modernity in the first half of the 20th century, not of its great successes. That's where it kind of came from. So Amitav's picture of the past, he's mentioned a few things about. His picture of the future is a world in which no single state, region, or civilization will dominate. It'll be shaped by a deep cultural and political and civilizational pluralism. Amitav's picture of what he calls multiplexity. Many layers, many actors, many parts of the world, playing their own games in their own worlds. 2 points to pick up, points of difference, I guess. The first is about system and structure. So in the book, Amitav says, well, today we live in a world where there's multiplexes, there are these different regions, we're seeing probably much stronger regionalization, different civilizational worlds being claimed. And he says, albeit more connected than in the past. And I think there has to be a question about whether that, albeit more connected, captures the changing nature of the modern global and the changing systemic or structural character of the modern global. And I don't mean just kind of the West in this. I mean basically an integrated global that grew out of capitalist modernity, particularly in the period since 1850. So the 3 systemic dimensions. Capitalism itself as something that is integrated, that doesn't just about patterns, it's not just about relations, fluxes, flows, connections, it's something structural. Instability, inequality as structural features of what we see. The world of power politics, of interstate, inter-imperial rivalries. And of course the world of planetary politics. The idea that these 2 structures are deeply implicated in a planetary system from which no one can escape. As Beckett said, there is no other place to go. Now, in the 19th century, Western thinkers overwhelmingly thought that these forces, particularly the first 2, were going to sweep everything in front of them. They were just going to pull everyone into a single world. This is Marx, Mill, Mackinder. The legacy of that still is there. It's there, for example, in those people who talk about US-China or the rise, it's simply in terms of the rise and fall of states. Well, we had Germany, Japan, now we've got China and India. It's all the same. It's just a kind of game that is timeless and we can play out. Now, one of the other great things that Amitav's book does is to show why that it's a hopeless way of understanding the politics of how the past influences where we are now. The history of the globalization of international society works against the idea that we can analyze everything simply in terms of these forces that are going to sweep everything beside them. So maybe maybe it is the 5%, but maybe the 5% is more deeply connected in a systemic way that we have to think about. And then finally, my other point is about the range of options on the table for thinking about a post-Western order. Now, on one hand, it looks as though the range has expanded, certainly within the West. Just think of the way Western debates, both on right and particularly on the left, particularly on the right, have just kind of grown far wider. The return of ideas of race, of civilization, of empire, things that we thought were off the table have come back on. And then, of course, the idea in a global world, ideas coming from so many different places. But on the other hand, well, how far have they expanded? Particularly if we think not of all of civilizational attributes, as Amitav does, but more narrowly about international order, the things that will link these different bits of the world together. There, behind a lot of the discussion of difference, is actually a lot of similarities. And here, this does take us back to the deep history. Because if one's looking for what is, at least in my world, called sort of primary deep institutions, diplomacy and as a capacity to negotiate, international law and a way of having rules, power managing power, those ideas don't come from the West, didn't come from the West, don't depend on anything to do with liberalism. They depend on a way of how is it in a plural world you might find a way of living together. And that's the basis for optimism. The basis, or one of the bases, I suppose, for pessimism is, well, two of them, and I'll finish here, is firstly that these systemic structural things are doing an awful lot of conflictual generating conflict and are extraordinarily difficult to manage. Systems bite back if you do bad things to them, and a lot of bad things are being done to these three systems that I mentioned, capitalism, geopolitics, and the planetary, and that's biting back. And then countering that biting back, well, old-style pluralism says good fences make good neighbors. Let's just have a little to do with each other. And of course, there are important things to do about managing fences. But in a deeply integrated world, we have to talk about how societies are organized, and the limits to that notion of returning to a pluralist world is one of the great challenges of living in a post-Western world. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. It really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Louise, for inviting me, and a pleasure to read Amitav's very persuasive argument with its vast mass of historical research and details. I cannot speak to the past 5,000 years, so I will focus, I'm afraid, on the 5% of your book, Amitav. And I'd like to follow up on what Andy just said, particularly about history and the sense of history, because it seems to me that over the last number of years, perhaps a decade, we have been subjected to a plague of precedents, of historical precedents. Are we living in the new 1939? Is there a new fascism in the United States? Is the left, does it represent the return of communism, as the Trumpists might say? There's a huge churning and recycling of old terms and of historical precedents. And yet none of them seem to fit. And I think they don't fit because these largely European historical precedents no longer account for the way in which the world works. The problem, of course, is that there is no other language, no other single historical tradition that can equally describe what we live through today. So we are in something of an interesting quandary. Now, of course, history has not always defined politics. Today, it is almost impossible to think politically without thinking historically. When we think about the future, we inevitably think about the past, whether to emulate it or to avoid it. And we think about the present, we also think about where this present has come from and how it has come to be. But this way of thinking about politics arguably only emerges during the 18th century. And before then, it is literary, epic texts, philosophical texts of the kind that Amitav described, the laws of Manu, that really shape political thinking. Indeed, thinking non-historically about politics was not so unfamiliar even into the 19th and early 20th century. So as an Indian historian, for instance, I have worked on the way in which an ancient text, the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of a great epic, the Mahabharata, came in the late 19th and early 20th century to constitute the definitive text, or one of them at least, for Indian nationalists who thought through what India's freedom might look like, not only, though they also considered history, not only by considering precedents either from the Indian past or the European or American one, but even more so by looking at an apparently abstruse philosophical work in which there is no history at all. In fact, the Bhagavad Gita is about the cycle of birth and death, about karma, right, among other things. So as recently as that, you can have politics taught in non-historical terms. It makes me wonder whether in the coming world of non-Western dominance, we might see a loosening up of history itself as a way of thinking about politics. Of course, the newish or the return of the language of civilization, again Andy mentioned this, as did Amitav, might offer an alternative set of historical themes to understand our present and our future. But for the moment, they seem to be still stub-like in character. They cannot account for the range and entirety of world or indeed global history. When we look at the West itself, something interesting seems to be happening as well. So as I began by saying, Western precedents no longer fit world history, but they no longer fit Western history either. So when you look at something like the much discussed attack on the Capitol towards the end of Trump's first term, at the very end of it, the debate about that event is fascinating in its own right, not only because the people who want to describe it as fascism or something of that nature, incipient dictatorship, are opposed by those who deny it, but even on its own terms, it refuses the analytical categories that this very debate has produced. So for instance, we often tend to think of this jamboree around the Capitol as being made up of white nationalists and who want or Christian nationalists or something of this sort, and no doubt that is true of many of its participants. But also in that melee were people waving the Indian flag, they were Hindu nationalists, people waving the imperial Iranian flag, who were Pahlavi, let's say nationalists, and people like the Afro-Cuban man who was the leader of the Proud Boys, supposedly a white nationalist group, right? So totally honeycombed with other histories. And yet apparently in almost multicultural fashion, gracefully included within this group of people. They didn't mind, they had their Confederate flags, they didn't mind the Indian flag or the Iranian flag or any of these people, Afro-Cuban or otherwise, right? So what exactly is going on here? Even the historical categories chosen by members of this group, for instance, which might be relate to the American Civil War through the Confederate flag or something of that nature, do not and cannot define what happened within the movement itself, which is full of immigrants, full of people bearing the flags of other countries, as I described. And this is true of individuals as well. If you think of whether it is President Trump himself or his vice president or Elon Musk or people who are associated with apparently nativist themes, anti-immigrant, anti-trans, anti-homosexual, etc. And yet it doesn't take much to see that they're either married to immigrants, in the case of Vance and Trump himself. Musk is himself an immigrant. They are, as it were, artificially enhanced in all kinds of ways. Vance changed his identity several times, a very trans thing to do. Elon Musk with his hair transplant and his Ozempic and his, these are people who have literally remade themselves and remake their identities repeatedly. So they're meant to stand for the natural, the given, and yet when you actually look at them, they exhibit almost the opposite characteristics and tendencies. It reminds me of, the French postmodernist philosopher Jean Baudrillard's books, Simulation and Simulacra, I think it was called, because it's almost like these Western leaders and movements are simulacra of, parodies of themselves. The fascism that they supposedly, or the nativism or the anti-immigrant feelings that they channel, and those are no doubt genuine, are betrayed at every move. Kash Patel, like myself, an East African Asian, heads the FBI. You see this in this country as well, in the Reform Party, in the Conservative Party and elsewhere. So what is going on? I think there too, within the West, you see a kind of, I don't know what to call it. Is it a decline? Is it a kind of self-parody? Something very curious is going on. Now, it might be turning back to history and repeating something that Andy Hurrell said at another event, that in retrospect, a process like decolonization from the middle of the 20th century might end up being a more important phenomenon to our present than the Second World War itself, which it closely followed upon. Right? If that is the case, then we really have to rethink our historical categories and what serves as precedent. But the non-West too, if the West might have reduced itself in some ways into a set of simulacra, the non-West too has a kind of political simulation going on, and this civilizational language, I think, might be among those simulations. It's not clear what these things refer to. So civilizations, what I mean is the idea of the civilizational state, whether Russian or Chinese or to some degree Indian. Well, it seems you have to be a large country to participate in this kind of debate. But as I mentioned earlier, these are truncated visions. They really cannot account for world history or global politics. They do go beyond the borders of those states, and that's what's interesting. It's like they might form the nub of some other kind of political future or political imagination. But we don't know what those things look like. So the civilizational state almost represents a kind of penumbra, and it's what goes beyond the states that I think is interesting, from which the kind of new world orders that Amitav describes might proceed. So I'm agreeing with him there. Now, among those futures, possible futures, are if you will, non-sovereign forms. If sovereignty is the Westphalian form, par excellence, that Amitav also writes about, we can think, returning to decolonization, of these political imaginations that rescind or renounce sovereignty. So I'm thinking here in particular of the work of someone like Gary Wilder or Adam Getachew, who write about how many of these countries that emerged from colonialism realized that the small states that would be produced as a result would actually not have sovereign power, or they would only have so nominally. And they therefore came to think about federal structures and regional alignments instead, which were additive. the European Union, if in some sense, is a realization of such a vision. But may I suggest that the visions predate the EU and actually belong to the anti-colonial or post-colonial world. So that's one way in which we can think about new visions. And I'll come to an end here. There are other nubs that we can see of the gesture towards a future that we still don't know. Whether it is the so-called Global South's push in the recent wars, both in Ukraine and Gaza, for neutrality and for ceasefires. It's almost neutrality has been brought back to political language by the Global South. For long it was a mainstay of all political thinking, but it's disappeared since the end of the Cold War. It's these countries that have brought this back to our world. And of course, smaller countries are much more attuned to mediation, to neutrality, to multilateral organizations than big, powerful countries which think they can do without them. And so it's to these smaller countries, apparently not so powerful ones, that we might want to look. And indeed, a lot of mediation internationally today is done by these countries. Some are very rich, like Qatar, which is in effect a city-state. Some are much bigger, but they don't belong to, if you will, the traditional world of political dominance. So the biggest question today, I think the biggest problem is how we might replace, or how these actors I would describe might replace the old balance of power politics that had formed Cold War internationalism. And you cannot think about Cold War internationalism without the Soviet Union. In a way, it's the end of the Cold War that puts that system into crisis. How can that be replaced? Not by unipolarity, I agree with Amitav, but with something else. And the biggest danger, and this goes back to something Louise was saying earlier, is that the existing order will not go gracefully. And that is so like Amitav, I'm not afraid of what comes after, but I'm afraid of how we might get to that place. Thank you.
Well, we're going to have Q&A now, so we'll invite the speakers back to the stage, please, and then we can, maybe I'll go in the middle, Andy, if you don't mind. We've got, but just to reassure you, we've got some more in the drinks reception. I'm sure all the speakers might have comments for each other and questions, but let's pause on that and take a round of questions from the room. I've been told I'm supposed to accept some online questions, but I don't know where they are, or are there any?
They're there.
Oh, you've got them. So let's start with a few questions from the room. If you could identify yourself, and because we've only got slightly less than half an hour, if you don't mind, identifying yourself, keeping your question fairly short so we can make sure that as many people can ask a question as possible. So the gentleman with the hand up there.
My name's Nick Van Heer. I'm associated with the Centre on Migration Policy and Society in the Anthropology Department. Thanks to all the speakers for great presentations. I'm going to address my question to Professor Acharya. The title is The Once and Future World Order. We heard a lot about the past, a lot about the current situation, but not so much about the future. Faisal touched on it a bit and mentioned some approaches and so on. So I'd like to ask if you could say how you think the world order will shape up. Let's say that's the realist position, and then what kind of world order you would like to see. So my point is, we're very good at criticism of this and that and the other, but we so rarely say what we actually want.
Thank you. Charles, and then we're going to take 3 questions, I think. Charles is next, and then one other, and then maybe one online.
Charles Godfrey, Oxford Martin School.
in addition to the dominance of the West, we have the dominance of the dollar. And with the, I think in Giscard d'Estaing's word, the exorbitant privilege that that gives to the US. And my question is, do you see the dominance of the dollar going? And is it possible for the dominance of the West to decline while the dollar still retains its privileged position?
Great question. There's with the lady at the front. Sorry, could you just, lady at the front first? We might have to do a second round. Thank you. Go ahead.
I put it to you that there is no world order at the moment. It's a complete delusion that we are kidding ourselves. We're in planetary collapse, 2 to 3 billion, threatened with food insecurity, about to escalate dramatically, all as a result of addiction to exponential growth, which happened all during the period that was covered in the book. And we need to snap ourselves out that illusion. And I think it's a search for identity that we were seeing in the rise of nationalism, because we haven't got a clue where to go. Well, I would say the degrowth movement does know. Kate Raworth is advising us with donut economics and the well-being economy.
Right. Shall we have one? Can you cope with 4 questions? There's a gentleman there, and then Haitong. Well, maybe we're going to have 5. Sorry. You'll have to be selective in your answers. Haitong, you'll be the last one of this round.
Hi, good evening. My name is Hamid Hamirani. I was a former advisor to the Minister of Finance in Oman, and I just now run some sort of sovereign advisory service. What I would like to understand and sort of have for the panel's comment on the technology, the impact of technology. We saw Mamdani election of a mayor, and how Generation Z are also having a completely different behavioral traits. So when you bring the technology, what happened in USA mayor election, and the behavioral traits changing, how would that shape the world order?
Right. So last question from Haitong, and then we'll seek some answers. He's in front of you, sorry. This gentleman here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Haitong Du, I'm a DPhil in international relations student. And my question is to Amitav. When I was reading on Global Order by Andy, he talked about these 2 potential futures, one being regionalization and the other being empires reborn, which I think is particularly interesting. Are empires coming back, and if so, in what forms? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll invite the speakers. Is there anyone online asking a question at the moment?
We just have one question at the moment.
Do you want to add that into the mix? Thank you, yeah.
Could you comment on the recent Tanzanian elections?
Oh, okay. Well, excellent. Well, Andy, shall we go this way? Andy, would you like to start? Any comments? You don't have to answer all the questions, obviously. Just if there's anything you want to pick up on, and then
well,
go about this.
Let me pick up. I mean, I think the empire question is really interesting because it gets to the old and the new. And the idea, I mean, I was brought up with a sort of, yes, empire to nation state, decolonization, terribly problematic, but we kind of knew where it was all going. And then, people from all sorts of places, nationalists, but liberals as well, said, well, if we get there, it'll be good. Michael Walzer in A World of Nice Liberal Nation States. That's not the way it's gone. Empires come back. And empire crosses over into, for example, this idea of big civilizational units. Because many people who talk about the civilizational units are much, well, not always, but often much coyer about what actually is the nature of the political organization. But that's where the sort of the modern changing comes in, and particularly the idea that if one of the dominant trends of the past 150 years has been a diffusion of power, greater capacities for social mobilization, which has brought down empires, then that clearly isn't going to go away. And that ties in very neatly with technology, because there are 2 obvious kind of crossover, many, but just schematically 2. One is obviously technology kicking in with geopolitical rivalry, China, US, AI, all the rest. The other, and this seems to me one of the really big questions about technology, is the increasing speed of technological change and development centralizing or diffusing power, whether that's public power or private power. My sort of hunch, and fitting in with this, is actually it's diffusing power. That's the way it's really going to go. But that question, there's a lot of centralizing and kind of clumping and agglomerating of power going on. And I think that dynamic between centralization and diffusion is really, for me, the most critical question to ask about technology. One thing, and I'll stop. Charles and the dollar, I mean, again, schematically, I think there's two sort of kinds of answers. One is the sort of, what one might sort of say is a kind of the economist answer, which is yes, you could imagine that the dollar carrying on, except that the contamination of the global monetary order by geopolitics is proceeding so fast, and indeed the US is leading that contamination, that it's really working to bring down a monetary system with a special role for the dollar, which many people accepted, albeit with the exorbitant privilege, because it provided at least some aspects of a global public good that is now being eroded and brought down from within, more than from without.
You have I don't have the mics, okay. No need,
You do, you're
I
mic'd
do,
up.
okay.
You on mic.
So there was a question directly addressed to me in the beginning that was about future, how I so little about the future, so much about the past. That's what the book was intended to be. In fact, that's what I wanted to do, write about the past, because I wanted to provide an alternative narrative about the past. And the future is always tricky for academics. We have a terrible, terrible record of predicting the future. And but because this, again, I wanted, this book, when you're writing for a commercial publisher, you also have to take into account, they spend an enormous amount of, make an enormous investment, and they want to recoup their profit. And I actually recoup their, losses, the money they paid to me for writing this book. But I actually felt that the past, re-understanding or reinterpreting the past is much more important than understanding the future. Because as a professor, as a student of international relations, so much of what I wrote about the book, I did not know 10 years ago. I myself, 30 years career as a professor of international relations, and I did not actually know about the Greek democracy polis. The liberty was not really liberty. I did not know that free trade or open trading in Indian Ocean long preceded that in anywhere else, or was much more open than the Roman Empire's so-called free trade. I accepted hegemony, hegemonic stability as an axiom. I did not know there are so many examples of world order, a regional world order, which were not hegemonic. I did not know that the Geneva Conventions were word by word anticipated by the Code of Manu. I did not know that perspective art, next time you go to Asmolean, one of my favorite museums, you see that art would not have been possible without a guy called Al-Hajjan, was born in Baghdad, born in Basra, educated in Baghdad, and wrote the first book on science of optics that Givati and others emulated a copy in the library of the Vatican Library. When I tell this to my students, and my students are mostly American, 90% of my students are American from East Coast, their eyes just bulge out, and we have this shared journey and about trying to discover things that we didn't know about. I started this course with Henry Kissinger's text. I went to his book launch, got him to sign 2 copies, maybe one will, when the price will go up, and he did sign. But then I said, I cannot just use this text. I have to have, and there are a lot of other good texts, bits and pieces, but not in one place. And I could not find a single text written in English language, published by a major international press, and written by, I'm kind of partly non-Western. I was born in India, but I spent a lot of time outside, but written by such a person. So that's what kind of become a kind of a most stimulating, very exciting, but also very powerful driving force. So that's why I wanted to focus on history. About the future, I can all say that, like any novel you read, John Grisham and others, they said they have this, what is coming next? The last chapter, last 5 pages, this will be in my next book. Okay, this will be in my next book. So just one other question about empire. In my first chapter, I say very clearly, empire is not dead. We don't have to revive it. It's still alive. I mean, we are all products of empire. Every single person here is a product of empire. We imbibe, we live. The United States is an empire, no matter how they deny it. So empire is the biggest sort of ancestor to all the world orders we're talking about. So empire was never far from my mind. And it's not just coming back, it was always there in different forms. Thank you. Faisal, any comments?
As a Tanzanian, I cannot resist but respond to that question.
It's your question.
And I'll weave it into the other themes and the other questions that have emerged. And Tanzania, of course, was always seen as, if not a model country, a stable country compared to all its neighbors. It's never had, there was one in its early days of independence attempted military coup, never military rule, never internecine conflict or civil war, orderly, progression. Okay, it's only had one political party throughout its career, in power, that is. It was a socialist country. And I always thought to myself that, and I grew up in socialist Tanzania, that it was the socialism of Tanzania which allowed it to be the stable country that it was. It had equalized people, not without some degree of coercion, but nevertheless, it worked, unlike its capitalist peers, Uganda and Kenya, which were both disaster stories and continue to be so. I think what's happening today is not simply the fact that the single party in power has pushed back on multi-party democracy and really rigged these elections, giving rise to these protests. But more than that, it's the fomenting of this violence, to me, indicates the final passing away of Tanzania, not as a socialist state any longer. It long ceased to be that, but as a Cold War state. It's the process of liberalization from the 1990s that transformed this country. And there was a mismatch between one party rule on the one hand and the increasingly liberalized and uncontrolled economic order on the other. And this is a familiar story. In a way, we are seeing the passing away before our own eyes of the remnants of the Cold War world. The Middle East is the same story. Iran is the only one left. Iran is a Cold War state, late Cold War state. It's an ideological republic, like a Cold War republic. Don't be distracted by the Islamic identity of it. It might as well have been some other kind of ideological form. Syria has gone, Libya has gone, Iraq has gone. That's sort of India, sort of Iran left. Israel is very interesting because, if you will, it is also a Cold War state, but arguably it has changed in the meantime. It's no longer what it was either, right? So the ground is being cleared, and that history is coming to an end before our very eyes. What's interesting is, as Amitav was saying, and Andy said before, empires have remained, and citing the work of the UCLA historian Sanjay Subramaniam, you can say, like he argues, that there are certain countries like China, like India, like the United States, that have actually retained their imperial form. They're all pluralistic in various ways. They might be hierarchical in others. Their borders have shifted somewhat. But if you take India, a country of incredible diversity and plurality, this is the only country I know of in which hundreds of millions of Indians have no common language with hundreds of millions of their fellow Indians. If I go to South India, I know nothing. I might identify some Sanskrit-derived words. That's it, all right? Yet it holds together as a great, if you will, democratic empire. So it might be that the imperial form is not like it's just coming back. It has always been with us, but it has changed shape in the meantime.
Thank you, Faisal. We've only got a few minutes left, but if there's anyone else, well, yes, 3 or 4 minutes, yes. Well, I've seen 2 hands, and I'm going to take those. I've seen 3. So they're very quick questions and very quick responses. So first, the lady. Well, I don't mind who. Okay, you go first, since you're near the mic. There are 2 behind you, 2 women behind you.
Well, thank you. My name is Klaus Song. I work in a think tank on China in Berlin. So my question is, you all mentioned on how we proceed to the post-Western order. And my question here is that when you see the US-China competition more intensified, do you think that it's a good thing we can see that through competition, in a very economic sense, through competition, we might have a better competition to offer to these other countries, for example, in ASEAN countries, or in Middle East, or in Central Asia, or actually when we're taking on a look on a liberal order, their competition is actually eroding the liberal order and making more assertive to each other. How do you think we are moving to the post-Western order in that sense? Thank you.
Thank you. And the two in the row behind you. 2 speakers.
Hello, I'm Barbara Sturbatz. I'm a journalist fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. You said that transition is on the way. Can we do this transition without a total decline of human rights, of women's rights? Because we see these things happening in US and in the Europe, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Czechia, in all parts of the world. Is it possible to save the level of the human rights that we achieved and that are now really declining?
Thank you. And the last question, the person at the end of the row in front of you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Just briefly, please.
Kogila Balakrishnan from the University of Warwick. I don't want to go home very depressed today. I believe, being a constructivist, I want to look at the future world order, because the history, the past is important, but the future is also equally important. And one issue that we have probably not touched in detail is the issue of value. I see that there's a huge emphasis on value. Like, there are things like net zero or energy transition and other values and norms that different society is embracing. So do we see a future where we could gravitate not east or west, but based on values and norms? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll allow you 1 minute each. But you can continue the conversation in the reception, because we've got a reception starting soon. So would you like to, well, let's go the other way around. Faisal, do you want to say any more? You don't have to.
All I'd say is I'll give you an anecdote, which is that a China expert at Harvard, who happens to be a friend of mine, Michael Pewitt, said to me that when Trump first became president, the Politburo was concerned because they wanted 50 more years of American dominance under which they could grow. And they said to themselves, the curtains have parted before their time and we've been pushed to the front of the stage, whereas we actually want the American umbrella. This is actually a common story with India, with China, with Russia. It's the too quick exit that is the problem, not that they want to take over.
So I'll make 2 points. One is actually an overarching formulation that came to me when Andy Hurrell was talking about Hadley Bull revolt against the West. I think what we are seeing here is, as you remarked, that United States is reasserting, right? So it's actually revolt against the rest. The United States and Trump is a consequence of the inability of whatever you call it, liberal order, Western dominated order, to actually provide for their own people and also manage world order. But it's not going to go down without fighting. So it's a revolt against the rest. About optimism, the last question, you don't have to go home feeling depressed. That's why you should read my article in New York Times. There's a copy there. I have been branded as an optimist for a long time, but I think the reason why I'm optimistic, and this is also goes back to the question of what is the relevance of so much history or so little of the future in the book, is because I thought a lot of the examples looking at history, you'll find that it's not, I don't believe in cyclical history, but I think you'll find it's eclectic history. You will find periods of so-called relative happiness, periods of decline, periods of war. It's never been anything linear, that we're moving all towards destruction or moving all towards progress. And the history I provide is not going to repeat itself in the same way, but it gives you a range of possible outcomes, that things can happen in different ways. And policymakers, instead of saying that America is the decline, West is decline, everything falls apart, they're actually thinking, no, it doesn't have to be like that. There are possibilities, and this is a kind of things that you can mine from, and then we'll see. There are ways of managing. None of the things we are seeing, maybe with the exception of nuclear weapons and a global scale calamity of climate, but a regional calamity of climate. Many civilizations have fallen because of global warming, and it's documented in my book. But at the global level, maybe there are a couple of things that are new. But even civilizational myths, like in India, you have called pralaya, you know, from India, total devastation, complete annihilation of the world. So, didn't happen. So there is optimism. So you can get optimism out of that. So please take a look at the book and try to think, be optimistic out of it.
Last word to Andy.
Okay. US-China, I mean, in a sense, order building through competition. So China leading a different way of thinking about managing climate and the environment. On the university website, Tom Hale has a recent piece, which is actually optimistic about all the things that are happening despite the big obvious negativity. So that's there as a possibility, and we have to think about, well, what might be involved. The problem from a kind of traditional point of view is that still doesn't escape the problem of power. It's not interest, and actually I'm going to come back to this. I don't even think it's values. It's a question of how do we actually manage the necessity of collective power, but its dangers. That's the age-old problem. Age-old, literally going back through the civilizations that Amitav looks like. Human rights, I mean, we haven't said much about values. We can talk about values of particular civilizations, but we can also talk about the spread of demands shared for greater justice of different kinds, which has been one of the great things that stands behind the diffusion of power that we've witnessed over the past 150, 200 years. And that hasn't gone away. Obviously, the great challenge is to recognize that we cannot just be would-be modern-day Kissingers and somehow just put that all back in the box, 19th century concert of powers, ignore it, human rights, ignore it. It is a part of the world that we're living in, fueled by, again, technological change and communication. So the question has to be, can we identify the crucial sort of pinch points and crossover points where those things really hit? One, just final word, I mean, intervention. I mean, again, a classic term of how we thought of living together. Intervention, all of our traditional ways are being eroded, but the necessity of working out in an interconnected world, what are the forms of interfering in each other's societies, which are really the most dangerous and problematic, and that we have to refine some basic ground rules. Because if we don't find those, then, and this is, I guess, finally, where I do differ a little bit from Amitav, I actually think that these shared collective dangers, the renewed danger of nuclear winter and of the failure to tackle climate change, are so big that we really are going to face, I didn't pick up your problem, but I agree with you, the deep, deep challenge of living in a disorderly world.
Well, thank you so much, and it only remains join me in thanking the speakers, and then, of course, join us just next door for the reception. So thank you again, very exciting, and we've got more to talk about.